The air over Fayette County hung heavy, a suffocating blanket of humidity and red dust that coated the back of the throat, tasting of iron and impending rain. It was May 1862, and the Blackwood plantation sat baking under a relentless Texas sun, the sky bruising purple in the western horizon with the promise of a violent thunderstorm. But the electricity crackling in the stagnant afternoon air was not merely meteorological. While the distant thundering cannons of the Civil War were tearing apart the fabric of the nation hundreds of miles away, here, in the heart of the Brazos River Valley, the tension was more intimate, confined to the brutal, silent hierarchy of cotton and flesh. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of ozone, mixing with the pungent, earthy reek of manure and the sharp, metallic tang of animal terror. Inside the main breaking corral, a structure of reinforced cedar posts that usually held firm, the sound of splintering wood shattered the oppressive silence. Storm, a stallion of massive proportions and a temperament to match the darkening skies, was tearing the earth apart. He was a creature of pure, distilled rage, his coat matted with thick foam and dust, his eyes rolling back to show the whites, the frantic look of an animal that had decided to kill or die. The ground shook rhythmically as 1,200 pounds of muscle slammed against the fencing, the impact reverberating through the souls of the men standing nearby. These were seasoned breakers, men with leather-tough skin and scars mapping decades of labor. Yet they pressed their backs against the far rails, eyes wide with a primal, sinking fear. No whip, no shout, no heavy rope could penetrate the red haze of the animal's fury. The beast had already snapped a lead line as if it were sewing thread. Then, a shadow detached itself from the cluster of terrified laborers. Silas. He was 17, though his ribcage showed through his rough-spun shirt like the rungs of a ladder, and his face, weathered by the merciless sun, held the stillness of an old man waiting for the end. He did not possess the broad shoulders of the blacksmith or the commanding voice of the drivers. He was unassuming, almost spectral in his movements. As the older slaves hissed low, frantic warnings, begging him to step back, Silas drifted into the center of the dust cloud. He moved like smoke, soundless and fluid, his bare feet making no noise on the churned earth. The stallion wheeled around, nostrils flaring like furnace doors, hooves pawing the dirt, ready to charge the intruder. Silas did not raise a hand in defense. He did not crack a whip or shout a command. He simply stood there, a frail, solitary figure against a mountain of violence, and opened his mouth. What came out was not a command. It was not English, nor was it the dialect spoken in the quarters. It was a sound that barely registered as human, a low, sibilant vibration that seemed to mimic the rustle of dry cornstalks, rubbing together, or the sigh of wind slipping through a cracked floorboard. It was a whisper that carried no semantic meaning to human ears, a friction of air against the palate that felt ancient and wrong. Yet, it struck the stallion with the force of a physical blow. Storm froze mid-stomp. The tension drained from the animal's arched neck instantly, the rock-hard muscles going slack as if the bones beneath had turned to water. The horse's eyelids drooped, glazing over with a milky, narcotic stupor, and he lowered his massive head until it almost touched Silas's shoulder. The silence that followed was louder than the chaos. From the veranda of the main house, the white overseers watched, their cigars forgotten in their hands. They didn't cheer. They stared with a cold, gnawing unease, witnessing a power they owned but could not comprehend, a quiet dominance that felt less like horsemanship and more like a conversation between ghosts. This narrative, ladies and gentlemen, extends far beyond the dusty, sun-bleached confines of a Fayette County stable or the peculiar, inexplicable talents of a quiet boy named Silas. It is a solemn descent into the shadowed crevices of the American past, a journey into the deep, often deliberately obscured corners where the boundaries between the supernatural and the brutal, crushing reality of chattel slavery blur into a singular, haunting tapestry. Here at Slavery Stories, our mandate is not to traffic in simple folklore or to entertain with ghost stories. We exist to excavate the silence. We aim to pull back the heavy velvet curtains of history to reveal the raw, unvarnished wood beneath, the narratives that have been buried under layers of legislative erasure and comfortable amnesia. We are here to speak of the things that were whispered in the dark because they were too dangerous to be spoken in the light. To understand the story of Silas, one must first understand the texture of the evidence we have unearthed. This account is reconstructed from fragments that, by all logic, should have been destroyed or lost to the rot of time. We are speaking of brittle medical journals with cracked spines, smelling of camphor and stale tobacco, penned by confused physicians in the dim, flickering light of oil lamps, their handwriting betraying a trembling uncertainty. We rely on the hushed, oral lineages passed down on front porches in the humid Texas twilight, stories whispered while the crickets screamed in the tall grass, ensuring the masters could not hear the transference of forbidden memory. It is in these fragile intersections, between the cold, clinical script of a slaveholder's inventory and the spiritual resilience of the enslaved, that we find the truth of this episode. Consider the year. 1862. Texas is a cauldron of heat and secessionist fervor, a place where the earth itself seemed to sweat under the glare of an unforgiving sun. The Union blockade is tightening. The air is thick with the smoke of a distant war and the immediate, suffocating humidity of the cotton fields. The red dust of Fayette County coated everything: the leaves of the oak trees, the flanks of the horses, and the weary faces of those in bondage. In this era, survival was a daily, grueling negotiation with death. For a boy like Silas, born into a system that categorized him as property, possessing a gift that defied natural law was not a parlor trick or a blessing to be celebrated. It was a dangerous anomaly. It was a spark in a powder keg. We explore how abilities that border on the mystical, talents that might be revered as miraculous in free societies, became complex burdens under the lash, sources of both awe and profound peril. This episode is a mosaic of suffering and wonder, built upon the meticulous piecing together of Dr. Elias Thorne's frantic, ink-stained notes and the guarded, sacred memories of the Blackwood community. We will walk through the valley of the shadow of death, examining how the inexplicable manifested in a world designed to crush the human spirit. If you believe that history is not merely a list of dates, but a living, breathing testament to the human capacity to endure the impossible, then you have found your proper gathering place. We invite you to subscribe and ring the bell, not for entertainment, but to bear witness to these resurrected voices. Now, let us brush away the dust of the present. Let us return to the stifling heat of that mid-century cabin, where the air was heavy with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, and where the first breath of this mystery was drawn. The birth of Silas, on a cold, late evening in 1845, was not heralded by the usual hopeful cries that marked the arrival of new life, nor by any expressions of joy. Instead, the air in the small, dilapidated cabin on Blackwood Plantation was filled only with the quiet, strained groan of his mother and the heavy, weary sigh of the old midwife. This was one of the most humble and poorest dwellings on the vast estate, its very structure seeming to sag under the weight of perpetual hardship. A single, sputtering tallow candle fought a losing battle against the oppressive darkness, its feeble, trembling flame casting long, dancing shadows that stretched and twisted across the uneven, packed earth floor. The rough-hewn, tattered walls stained with years of accumulated grime, seemed to perpetually weep dampness, permeating the space with the acrid scent of wood smoke and an underlying, persistent tremor of fear that never truly dissipated. Silas's mother, a young woman named Alara, lay utterly spent, barely clinging to the edges of consciousness. Her body, ravaged by the relentless dawn-to-dusk toil in the scorching cotton fields, felt like a vessel emptied of all strength. Each shallow, ragged breath she drew was a fragile, audible struggle, a testament to a life defined by exhaustion. The midwife, affectionately known as Old Ma'am Sarah, moved with a somber, practiced grace. Her face, a profound mosaic of deep-set wrinkles, resembled an ancient map, each line a testament to decades of witnessed suffering and hard-won wisdom. Her hands, gnarled and strong, worked with an almost ritualistic efficiency, honed through countless deliveries, performed in the dim, shadowed reality of enslaved existence. When the infant finally emerged into the chill air, there was no sharp, indignant cry, no familiar sound of a newborn asserting its presence. Silas lay in Ma'am Sarah's calloused, trembling hands, his tiny, still swollen eyes wide open, unblinking. They were not the unfocused gaze of a newborn, but seemed to fix, directly, unsettlingly, upon the old woman's face, as if perceiving, understanding, and absorbing the profound, silent weight of the world he had just entered. A shiver, cold and inexplicable, snaked through Ma'am Sarah's ancient bones, causing her hands to tremble with a sensation that was both chilling and deeply, primally unsettling. She leaned closer to Alara, her voice dropping to a low, husky whisper that barely stirred the stale air, a sound almost swallowed by the mother's faint, struggling breaths. "This child, he is different," she murmured, her own gaze still caught in the infant's unwavering stare. "He sees what we do not. And his silence, it is not merely silence." With a mixture of reverence and apprehension, Sarah gently laid the unprotesting infant onto his mother's chest. Yet her eyes remained clouded with a strange, almost fearful intuition, as if she had just touched something that had drifted in from a realm beyond their earthly understanding. In that hushed, heavy moment, amidst the pervasive cold, the clinging dampness, and the ever-present scent of human struggle, a destiny began to unfold, one promising both an extraordinary, potentially miraculous gift and an incomprehensible, perhaps terrifying, burden. It was a fate woven into the very fabric of a life that, from its silent inception, would utterly defy all conventional understanding on the Blackwood plantation, leaving an indelible mark that would ripple through the hidden currents of history. By the time Silas reached his 4th winter, the silence that wrapped around him had transformed from a childhood quirk into a heavy physical weight that unsettled the very air of the slave quarters. While other children, their limbs lean and dusted with the red clay of East Texas, chased makeshift balls of rag and twine through the alleys between the cabins, Silas sat apart. He was a small, motionless anchor in a world of constant, frantic motion. He often positioned himself in the deep shade of the chinaberry trees, his fingers tracing complex, nonsensical patterns in the dry dirt, his eyes fixed on the horizon, or perhaps on something only he could perceive in the shimmering heat haze that distorted the cotton fields. He did not play. He observed. His presence was spectral, a quietude so profound that it seemed to dampen the noise around him. The first undeniable manifestation of his anomaly occurred on a suffocating afternoon in July, when the air was thick enough to taste, smelling of wood smoke, curing tobacco, and the impending violence of a summer storm. From the direction of the main house, the distant, chaotic baying of the master's foxhounds signaled the return of a hunt. These were not domesticated pets. They were lean, scarred instruments of the plantation's brutality, bred for stamina and aggression, their coats matted with burrs and dried blood. As the pack was herded past the quarters by a mounted overseer, the noise was deafening, a cacophony of yelps and snarls that sent chickens scattering in a flurry of feathers and dust. Suddenly, the rhythm of the pack broke. One animal, a massive black and tan hound known as Brute, separated from the group. Brute was legendary among the enslaved population for his viciousness. He bore a jagged scar across his snout and had a reputation for snapping at any hand that dared offer him scraps. Catching a scent, the beast turned, his lips curling back to reveal yellowed fangs dripping with thick saliva. He locked his gaze on Silas, who sat alone near the washing tubs. The women working there, their hands raw and slick with harsh lye soap, froze in terror. A scream began to rise in the chest of a young girl nearby, but it never left her throat. The dog charged, a blur of muscle and malice, kicking up dust as he closed the distance. Silas did not scramble away. He did not cry out for his mother. He simply raised his head, his dark, impenetrable eyes locking onto the charging beast. He lifted a single thin hand, palm open, in a gesture that looked less like a defense and more like a greeting. The sound that escaped the boy's throat was not a command, nor was it a word in any known tongue. It was barely audible, a friction of air against vocal cords that sounded like dry leaves skittering over stone, or the wind passing through hollow reeds. It was a frequency more felt in the teeth than heard by the ear. The effect was instantaneous and defying all natural logic. Brute, mid-stride and growling, skidded to a halt, his claws digging furrows into the hard-packed earth. The feral light in the dog's eyes extinguished instantly, replaced by a glassy, heavy-lidded stupor. The growl died in a confused whimper. Slowly, the massive animal lowered his head, padded forward with a strange, lethargic gait, and collapsed at Silas's bare feet. The dog exhaled a long, shuddering breath, as if released from a lifetime of rage, and closed his eyes. Silas lowered his hand and returned to tracing patterns in the dirt, indifferent to the creature sleeping against his leg. The silence that followed was louder than the barking had been. The washerwomen stared, crossing themselves, the lie stinging their forgotten hands. This was no fluke. In the weeks that followed, the phenomenon repeated with unsettling regularity. A brooding hen, pecking violently at anyone who neared her clutch, would settle into a trance when Silas passed. Barn cats, wild and scratching, would go limp in his presence. Even the irritable mules, known for biting and kicking, would stand statue still as he walked by. Whispers began to circulate through the quarters, carried on the night wind like smoke. They spoke of the spirit talker, a child who trafficked with the unseen. It was a reverence born of deep fear, for in the brutal logic of the plantation, anything that could tame a beast so easily might one day draw the dangerous eye of the master. By the time Silas reached his 8th year, the suffocating anonymity of his early childhood had begun to fracture. It was 1853, a year recorded in the plantation ledgers for its blistering drought and the hardness of the soil. The incident that stripped away his cover occurred on a Tuesday morning, under a sky bleached white by the relentless Texas sun. In the lower fields, the air was thick with the smell of dry dirt, raw cotton, and the acrid musk of agitated livestock. A mule named Goliath, a notorious brute with scars mapping his flanks from years of resistance, had finally snapped. The animal was thrashing in the traces, overturning heavy wicker baskets, and sending pickers scattering into the furrows for safety. The overseer, Mr. Jedediah Cole, a man whose patience was as short as his temper, strode forward, the leather of his bullwhip cracking against his boot. He was prepared to beat the animal into submission or death, the violence hanging in the air like static electricity before a storm. From the periphery of this chaos, Silas emerged. He did not run. He drifted through the rising dust clouds with a stillness that defied the panic around him. He was small for his age, his clothes hanging loosely on a frame shaped by meager rations, but his eyes held a terrifying depth. As Cole raised his arm to strike, Silas stepped between the man and the heaving beast. He reached up, placing a small, dark hand on the mule's wet, trembling muzzle. The boy's lips moved, but no intelligible word came forth. Instead, a sound, or perhaps a vibration, rippled through the immediate vicinity. It was a low, rhythmic exhalation, softer than the rustle of the cotton leaves, yet heavy with an unseen weight. Goliath froze. The animal's ears, pinned back in aggression, swiveled forward. The tension in the mule's massive neck dissolved, and within seconds, the beast lowered its head, eyelids drooping as if sedated by a powerful opiate. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant cawing of a crow. Watching from the ridge on his chestnut mare was Mr. Alistair Blackwood. The master of the plantation sat high in his saddle, the creak of leather the only sound as he leaned forward. His face, usually a mask of aristocratic indifference, betrayed a flicker of calculation. He did not see a miracle. He saw a mechanism, a tool that had gone utilized. That evening, Silas was not sent back to the slave quarters, but was marched to the main house, smelling of earth and sweat, to stand in the parlor before Dr. Elias Thorne. Dr. Thorne, summoned from Lagrange, was a man of science, smelling of camphor, stale tobacco, and skepticism. The examination was dehumanizing and thorough. Thorne treated the boy not as a patient, but as a biological curiosity, measuring the circumference of his skull with cold metal calipers, checking his pupil dilation with a lantern, and testing his reflexes with a small hammer. The doctor demanded speech, but Silas remained mute, his gaze fixed on the dust motes dancing in the shaft of sunlight. It was only when Thorne brought in a chained, snarling yard dog to test the rumors that his skepticism shattered. Silas looked at the animal, released that same unintelligible whisper, and the dog collapsed into a docile heap at his feet. Thorne's fountain pen scratched furiously across the parchment later that night. He categorized the phenomenon as an inexplicable neurological anomaly, referencing theories of animal magnetism and hypnotic influence that defied current medical understanding. For Blackwood, the diagnosis confirmed his suspicion. Silas was no longer just a field hand. He was a valuable, albeit dangerous, asset. The master realized that such power required a tighter leash, for a voice that could command nature might one day learn to command men. By the time Silas reached his 12th winter, the peculiar silence that shrouded him had transformed from a plantation oddity into a commodity for his master's amusement. Mr. Alistair Blackwood, a man whose vanity was as vast and unyielding as the Texas plains, saw in the boy not a child, but a parlor trick to be paraded before his peers to establish dominance in the county hierarchy. The catalyst for this cruel theater was the acquisition of a Mustang stallion named Fury, a beast black as a starless midnight, with a coat that gleamed like polished obsidian and a temperament forged in the harsh, unforgiving wilds of the brush country. Fury had already maimed 2 experienced handlers, his hooves striking with the precision of a piston. Yet Blackwood, driven by a toxic mixture of avarice and pride, invited a delegation of neighboring planters, including the wealthy Mr. Sterling, to witness a spectacle of control. The wager was substantial, a sum of gold placed on the table between crystal tumblers of bourbon, betting that the silent boy could tame the untamable within minutes. The scene was set in the main breaking corral, where the air hung heavy and motionless, thick with the pungent aroma of cured tobacco, nervous sweat, and the dry, metallic tang of stirred dust. Fury paced the perimeter, his nostrils flaring red, breath blasting out in steam-like bursts, muscles coiling beneath his skin like oiled steel cables ready to snap. Into this arena of raw violence walked Silas. He looked impossibly small against the backdrop of rough-hewn timber and jeering men, his clothes ragged, his bare feet stirring the dirt. He did not look at the men leaning on the fence. His gaze was fixed solely on the heaving flanks of the stallion. As he stepped closer, the silence descended, a strange, pressurized quiet that seemed to suck the sound out of the wind itself. Silas began his whisper. It was not a sound that carried across the yard, but a low, thrumming vibration, a resonance that seemed to travel through the ground rather than the air. Miraculously, the stallion's ears flickered. The frantic pacing ceased. Fury stood trembling, not with rage, but with a sudden, narcotic heaviness, his eyelids drooping as the boy's unseen tether pulled him into a trance. The planters watched, mouths agape, cigars burning forgotten in their hands. Silas reached out a thin, trembling hand to touch the animal's sweat-slicked neck. It was a moment of profound, fragile connection. But the spell was shattered by human folly. A drunken guest, emboldened by liquor and impatient for action, let out a raucous, whooping shout, slapping the fence rail with his hat. The noise cracked through the trance like a gunshot. Fury exploded. In a blur of motion too fast for the human eye to track, the stallion reared and lashed out. The heavy hoof caught Silas squarely on the shin. The sickening crack of bone echoed louder than the shout, followed instantly by the boy's high, keen scream as he was flung backward into the filth. The ensuing weeks were a blur of agony and feverish delirium for the boy. Confined to a pallet of straw in a stifling corner of the quarters, Silas lay with his legs splinted in rough cedar, his body burning as infection threatened to claim him. The doctor, summoned not out of kindness but to protect an asset, set the bone without the mercy of laudanum. The grinding of the fragments sent shock waves through Silas that left him gasping, his fingernails digging furrows into the dirt floor. In the delirium of the sweltering nights, the whisper did not leave him. Instead, it turned inward. He heard the phantom stomping of hooves in his blood, a rhythmic thudding that matched the throbbing of his swollen limb. Silas emerged from that sick bed, changed. The innocence of his gift had been severed. He realized, with the crushing weight of adult understanding, that his ability to commune with nature was not a shield, but a target. He was a tool to be used until broken. The whisper that had once flowed from him like water now felt jagged in his throat, tainted by the memory of the kick and the laughter of men who viewed his suffering as a failed wager. His eyes, once filled with a distant wonder, now held the hard, polished look of a survivor who knows that in the eyes of his masters, his life was worth less than the horse that maimed him. The fracture in Silas's right tibia did more than tether him to a damp, moldering straw pallet. It severed the last, fraying thread of his childhood, plunging him into a world of shadow and stillness. For 7 agonizing weeks, the boy lay in the stifling semi-darkness of the infirmary cabin, a structure where the air hung heavy with the cloying scent of turpentine, stale sweat, and the bitter, earthy tang of Mam Sarah's willow bark poultices. Dust motes danced in the single, narrow shaft of light, piercing the warped cedar planks, marking time in a world that had moved on without him. Outside, the rhythmic clinking of chains and the distant rhythmic chant of the field gangs drifted in like the tide. But inside, Silas was marooned in a haze of fever and throbbing bone. When he finally emerged, blinking against the harsh Texas glare and leaning heavily on a crutch roughly hewn from seasoned hickory. The change was etched into the very set of his jaw. The passive vacancy of his gaze, once dismissed as simple-mindedness, had hardened into a bruised, ancient sorrow, the look of a man who has peered into a deep well and found no bottom. The animals, those sensitive barometers of the unseen, were the first to recoil from this new iteration of the stable boy. Where once a nervous gelding would have lowered its head into his palm, seeking the solace of his touch, now the creatures stood rigid, muscles locked in a trembling stasis. It was observed by the kennel keeper that the hounds no longer slept when Silas whispered. They went catatonic, their eyes rolling back to show the whites, suspended in a terrified silence that felt less like peace and more like the cold finality of death. Even the barn swallows, usually flitting fearlessly through the rafters, would abruptly cease their chatter and scatter into the rafters when he limped into the stables. His voice, previously a soft rustle of wind, had acquired a discordant resonance, a melancholic vibration that seemed to chill the humid air. It was a sound that made the skin prickle, carrying the weight of unwept tears and the heavy silence of forgotten graves, a frequency that repelled as much as it compelled. Ma'am Sarah, the plantation's oldest soul, whose skin resembled the cracked bark of the river oaks, recognized the shift immediately. In the quiet hours of the evening, while applying a salve of fat and comfrey to his atrophied muscle, she spoke to him not in the pidgin of the fields, but in the deeper, rhythmic cadence of her Gula ancestors. The candlelight flickered across her clouded eyes as she spoke of spirit talkers, those cursed with a veil too thin to separate the living from the soil's memory. "It ain't just the beast you quieten, child," she murmured, her voice like dry leaves skittering over stone. "You drink in the sorrow. The spirit talker don't just speak. He carries the heavy water." She warned that such a gift was a heavy yoke, a conduit for energies that the human mind was never meant to house, a bridge between the breaking heart of the beast and the listener's soul. Her warnings proved terrifyingly prophetic. The silence Silas imposed on the world began to roar within him. It started as a low, persistent hum behind his eyes, a physical vibration akin to a telegraph wire singing in a high wind, vibrating against the base of his skull. By night, this hum swelled into a cacophony that denied him rest. His dreams were no longer his own. They were invaded by the sensory debris of the land. He woke sweating, his heart hammering against his ribs, tasting copper and ash, his mind filled with the phantom sensations of a mule's exhaustion or the terror of a fox cornered by hounds miles away. The whisper had turned inward, and Silas, isolated by his pain and his power, realized with a dawning horror that he was no longer just calming the suffering around him. He was absorbing it, becoming a living vessel for the agony of the voiceless. The whispers about the boy did not stop at the cedar-fenced perimeters of the Blackwood estate. They seeped into the surrounding county like groundwater tainted by iron. The incident with the stallion Fury, combined with the grotesque image of the boy's shattered leg, had transformed local curiosity into a righteous, fearful fervor. In the nearby town of LaGrange, the atmosphere in the First Baptist Church had grown stifling, heavy with the scent of pine pitch and the sour perspiration of a congregation packed too tightly into the pews. It was here that Reverend Elijah Stone, a man with a face reddened by both the Texas sun and his own dogmatic fury, found his new crusade. He did not need to name Silas directly. His sermon on unclean spirits and beasts charmed by the devil's tongue struck a chord that vibrated through the humid air of the sanctuary. Stone pounded the pulpit, the wood groaning under his fist, his voice booming against the rafters as he warned that tolerating such dark whispers was an affront to divine will. He painted a picture of a contagion, a spiritual rot that would spread from the stables of Blackwood to the hearths of every God-fearing family in Fayette County. Meanwhile, back on the plantation, the air in the small, dim infirmary room smelled sharply of ethanol and bitter herbs. Dr. Elias Thorne had returned, not as a curious observer, but as a man whose professional pride had been severely bruised. The doctor's inability to categorize Silas's abilities had become a stain on his reputation, and he was determined to scrub it clean with the rough brush of 19th century medicine. Thorne moved with frantic precision, mixing sedatives and nerve tonics in glass beakers that clinked softly in the silence. He was convinced that the boy suffered from a form of hysterical neurosis, a chaotic misfiring of the mind that could be dampened by chemistry. Silas, still recovering from his fracture, was subjected to daily doses of these dark, viscous liquids. The boy's eyes, once sharp and filled with that unsettling ancient knowing, grew glassy and distant. The pupils dilated and sluggish. He spent his days in a chemically induced fog, his head lolling against the rough wood of the wall, the silence around him no longer charged with power, but heavy with exhaustion. Mr. Alistair Blackwood observed these proceedings from the shaded veranda of the main house, a tumbler of whiskey sweating in his hand. He was a man caught in a tightening vice. On one side lay the undeniable utility of Silas, an asset who could tame the untamable, but on the other stood the looming specter of social ruin. Letters from Reverend Stone had begun to arrive, sealed with aggressive wax stamps, demanding that the vessel of darkness be cleansed or cast out. The neighboring planters, men Blackwood relied on for trade and political standing, had begun to offer cold greetings and averted gazes in town. The threat was clear. If Blackwood continued to harbor what the county deemed a warlock, he would face ostracism that could cripple his standing in the Slavocracy. The master of the house watched the dust rise from the road where the doctor's carriage departed, realizing that the boy's silence was no longer enough. The county demanded a reckoning, and the price of protecting his valuable asset was rising higher than the cotton in his fields. By the late summer of 1862, the sky over Fayette County had hardened into a sheet of hammered brass. The drought was absolute, a relentless siege that turned the rich Texas soil into cracked pottery and coated every surface in a fine, choking layer of red dust. But the heat was not the only affliction visiting the Blackwood plantation. A virulent murrain, a cattle plague, had swept up from the coast, moving through the herds like a scythe. The air was thick with the cloying, sweet stench of rotting livestock and the acrid smoke of pyres burning in the distance. At the center of this grim tableau lay Patriarch, the plantation's prize Hereford bull, a beast of immense value and lineage. Now, however, the animal was reduced to a shuddering ruin, thrashing in the dust of the main corral, his bellows of agony echoing across the scorched fields like the trumpet of judgment. Alistair Blackwood stood at the fence, his face glistening with sweat and grim determination. The financial loss of the bull was a staggering blow, one that outweighed the moral thunder of Reverend Stone, whose warnings about the devil's boy still rang in the planter's ears. Desperation breeds impiety. Ignoring the whispers of his peers and the open hostility of the visiting parson, Blackwood gave the order. Silas was summoned from the shadows of the carriage house. The boy who emerged looked older than his 12 years. His frame was gaunt, his clothes hanging loosely on his limbs, and his eyes held the hollow, haunted look of someone who had peered too long into the dark. A hush fell over the gathered crowd, a mix of anxious overseers, neighboring planters wiping tobacco stains from their lips, and enslaved workers standing in silent, fearful clusters near the barn. The bull was a terrifying engine of pain, kicking up clouds of dirt, foam dripping from a muzzle hot with fever. Silas did not flinch, though his hands trembled. not from fear, but from a strange, resonant exhaustion that seemed to weigh down his very bones. He stepped into the corral, the smell of copper blood and sour fear overwhelming the senses. As Silas leaned in, closer to the heaving flank of the dying giant, the silence of the onlookers became absolute. He began to speak. It was not the soft, lulling sound he had used on the stallion Fury years before. This was different. It was a low, rhythmic cadence, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the teeth of those watching. Witnesses later described it as a keen, a mourning song in a language that predated the cotton fields, predated the ships, perhaps predated man himself. It was a sound of unburdening, heavy with the dust of the earth. Patriarch's thrashing ceased by degrees. The wild, bloodshot whites of his eyes rolled back, settling into a gaze of profound clarity. The tension drained from the massive neck muscles, the spasms quieting into stillness. The bull let out one final long exhalation, a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire drought, and then simply stopped. He collapsed, not with the violence of death, but with the heaviness of sleep. He was dead before he hit the ground. The silence that followed was heavier than the heat. There was no applause, no relief, only a cold dread settling in the stomachs of the white men, and a knowing look exchanged among the elders of the quarters. Silas stood over the carcass, his chest heaving, looking small and fragile against the dead giant. He hadn't healed the beast. He had ushered it out. It was a chilling revelation that hung in the humid air. The boy's power was not merely to calm the living, but to negotiate the terms of death. The silence that settled over Blackwood Plantation in the wake of the bull's passing was not the peace of resolution, but the heavy, suffocating stillness of a storm held in check. The dust raised by Patriarch's final struggle had barely returned to the cracked earth before the atmosphere shifted from awe to a cold, creeping dread. Alistair Blackwood, standing by the rail with the posture of a man watching his empire tremble, realized that the spectacle he had authorized was a catastrophic error. The air smelled of sulfur and fear, a pungent mix that seemed to emanate from the very pores of the gathered crowd. The stunned silence of the onlookers, initially paralyzed by the impossibility of what they had witnessed, began to fracture into murmurs of suspicion. These were not the hushed tones of reverence, but the sharp, jagged whispers of men who felt their reality slipping. Reverend Elijah Stone, seizing the moment like a hawk spotting prey, did not let the sun set before casting his judgment. His voice, usually confined to the timber walls of the church, now carried across the fields, condemning the unholy quiet as a pact with forces beneath the earth. He spoke of dark arts, masked as miracles, his sermons becoming the fuel for a fire that threatened to consume Blackwood's social standing. The neighboring planters, men who measured their lives in bales of cotton and the obedience of their chattel, looked at Silas not with curiosity, but with the terror of contagion. They feared that such power, if left unchecked, would spread like blight through their own quarters. Under this crushing weight, Blackwood made his move, swift, brutal, and administrative. Silas was erased from the stables. He was dragged from the warmth of the hay and the scent of the horses he understood so well, and thrown into a dilapidated curing shed on the far edge of the property. It was a structure of rotting pine and rusted iron, where the air was stagnant and smelled of old tobacco and decay. The sunlight there was thin, filtering through cracks in the warping wood, casting long prison bar shadows across the dirt floor. This was to be his world now, a solitary confinement designed to stifle the whisper that had quieted a beast. The decree was absolute. Any slave caught speaking of the boy or mimicking that strange, low sound would face the lash. The overseers walked the rows with renewed cruelty, their whips coiling like snakes, ensuring that the name Silas died on the lips before it could be spoken. To seal the burial of the truth, Blackwood turned to Dr. Elias Thorne. The physician, whose scientific curiosity had been the boy's only advocate, found his integrity withering under the planter's gaze. In the cool, dim library of the main house, amidst the smell of leather bindings and stale cigar smoke, history was rewritten. The scratching of Thorne's quill against the ledger was the sound of a lie being forged. He recorded Patriarch's death as acute heat stroke, complicated by bovine fever, a diagnosis that was palatable, mundane, and safe. As for Silas, the entry was clinical and dismissive. Subject exhibits signs of advanced mental degradation. Vocalizations are nonverbal delusions devoid of cognitive intent. The supernatural was reduced to madness. The miracle was reduced to a symptom. The ledger was closed with a heavy thud, sealing the narrative. Yet, documents and threats could not scrub the memory from the minds of those who lived in the shadows. In the slave quarters, when the fires burned low and the overseers were drunk or asleep, the story persisted. It lived in the glances exchanged between mothers, in the way the men handled the horses with a new, gentle reverence. They knew the truth of what lived in that rotting shed. The master's silence was a heavy blanket, yes, but beneath it, the memory of the boy's whisper hummed like a vibration in the earth, a secret frequency that no amount of ink or violence could truly silence. For over a century, the legend of Silas retreated into the hushed, humid evenings of porch-side storytelling among the descendants of Fayette County. It became a ghost story, a fragment of folklore dismissed by serious historians as the embellishment of memory or the comfort of myth. In the official county tax records and the ledger books of Alistair Blackwood, Silas was reduced to a mere line item. Male, 17, stable hand. With a value calculated in dollars, his life flattened into the ink of commerce. The silence Blackwood demanded had settled like the heavy Texas dust, burying the truth under layers of denial and the relentless march of reconstruction and modernization. But the earth has a way of rejecting secrets, and timber, no matter how thick, eventually rots to reveal what lies behind it. In the late autumn of 1987, a local preservation society began the arduous task of stabilizing the ruining shell of the Blackwood Manor. The air inside the structure was stale, thick with the smell of dry rot, dead wasps, and the musk of undisturbed decades. Workmen, peeling away water-damaged wainscoting in the cellar, stumbled upon a hollow sound behind the masonry. It was a false wall, hastily erected with mismatched brick and mortar that crumbled at the touch of a pry bar. Behind it lay a cramped, airless storage void, protected from the gnawing damp by the stagnant air. Inside, resting on a shelf covered in the gray fur of mold, lay the discarded conscience of the plantation, a tin lockbox containing documents that were never meant to survive the Civil War. The contents were not gold, but paper, brittle, yellowed, and smelling of vinegar and old leather. There were the private journals of Dr. Elias Thorne, bound in cracked calfskin, the spine broken from use. His handwriting, usually precise and clinical, deteriorated into jagged, pressured strokes as he documented Case S. He described not a medical condition, but a neurological resonance that defied the physiology of the era. He noted the temperature drops in the room when the boy entered, and the way birds would cease their song outside the window. Tucked between the pages were letters from Reverend Elijah Stone, the ink still angry and dark, blotched where his hand had shaken with rage. The paper felt heavy with his fury. He wrote of unholy silence and demonic pacts. his words a frantic plea to Blackwood to purge the plantation of the boy who could quiet the rage of beasts. These were not the ramblings of the superstitious poor, but the terrified admissions of educated men who had witnessed the impossible. Yet the most poignant discovery lay not in the manor, but beneath the rotting floorboards of a collapsed cabin on the property's edge, the quarters of the midwife, Ma'am Sarah. Found by an archaeological student sifting through the dirt, wrapped in oilcloth to ward off the termites, a small, hand-stitched booklet survived. The pages were rough, made of scrap paper, and the ink was a faded mixture of berry juice and soot. Here, in the shaky, phonetic script of a woman who learned to write in secret, was the true record. She spoke of Silas's birth during a storm that made no sound, and of the old blood that ran in his veins. She described his whisper not as a trick, but as a bridge to a world the white masters could not perceive. These artifacts, unearthed from the darkness, shattered the sanitized version of history. They proved that the erasure of Silas was a calculated act of fear, a desperate attempt to bury a power that the institution of slavery could neither break nor understand. The unearthing of these suppressed archives was not merely an academic discovery. It was the breaking of a seal on a tomb of silence that had held for over a century. When researchers finally pried open the false wall in the damp, lightless cellar of the decaying Blackwood Manor in the late 1980s, the air that escaped was stale, carrying the metallic tang of old iron and the sweet, cloying scent of moldering paper. The leather-bound journals of Dr. Elias Thorne, found wrapped in oilcloth that had long since become brittle and cracked, felt heavy in the hands, not just from the weight of the paper, but from the burden of the secrets they contained. As the pages were turned, the binding groaned, a dry, snapping sound that echoed in the stillness of the renovation site. The ink, once sharp and clinical, had faded to a rusty brown, yet the desperation in the pen strokes remained palpable, the handwriting deteriorating from elegant script into jagged, frantic scrawls as the dates progressed past the summer of 1862. The collective evidence pieced together from these fragile remnants painted a picture that was chillingly consistent. Dr. Thorne's final entry, a single unbound page tucked haphazardly into the back cover, offered a medical observation that defied all scientific logic of his time. He described a resonance, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to emanate from the very walls of his study whenever he reviewed his notes on the boy. He wrote of sleepless nights where the silence of the Texas plains was not empty, but filled with a pressure that pressed against the eardrums, a sensation he compared to the heavy, static-charged air that precedes a tornado. "It is not a sound," he scribbled, the ink blotted where his hand must have trembled, "but a presence that lingers, a question left unanswered by the earth itself." This was not the writing of a detached man of science, but of a witness grappling with a reality that his medical textbooks were woefully unequipped to explain. Contrasting the doctor's frantic intellectualism was the discovery of Ma'am Sarah's diary, a small, makeshift booklet concealed beneath a rotting floorboard in the ruins of the slave quarters. The paper was coarse, stained with the grease of tallow candles and the dirt of the floor, smelling faintly of the earth it was buried in. Her entries, written in a mix of broken English and Gula symbols, spoke of the gift as a physical weight. She described Silas not as a magician, but as a vessel. Her final entry, barely legible through the water damage, suggested that the boy's whisper did not merely soothe the animals, it absorbed their agony. It connected him to the raw, untamed energies of the land and the forgotten suffering of those who had tilled it. She wrote of echoes growing louder, implying that the boy had become a conduit for a sorrow too vast for one human frame to hold. Today, the fields of Fayette County lie under the same relentless, bleaching sun. The physical ruins of the Blackwood stables are gone, reclaimed by twisting mesquite and scrub oak. The wood long since returned to dust. Yet, locals and historians alike speak of a peculiar quality to the silence in that specific patch of land. It is a heaviness that hangs over the tall, dry grass, a stillness that feels attentive, as if the wind itself is holding its breath. As we close this dark chapter of American history, we are left with a haunting, unresolved question. Was the boy's whisper truly silenced by the master's decree, or did it merely sink into the soil, becoming part of the landscape? Perhaps the story of Silas is not a tale of the supernatural, but a testament to the fact that profound suffering and immense spirit leave a physical imprint on the world, an enduring echo waiting for those with the courage to listen to the hidden frequencies of our history.